The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its red earth cracked like old leather. Ayanna rode her paint horse across the familiar terrain, her dark eyes scanning the mesa where her childhood had died 15 years ago. The wind carried memories she'd tried to bury in the cities back east, the smell of smoke, the sound of gunfire, the screams that still echoed in her nightmares. She'd come back to this place once more, carrying a small leather pouch containing her grandmother's ashes and a heart full of ghosts she hoped to finally lay to rest. "Easy, Takoda," she whispered to her horse as they approached the burned remains of what had once been her family's camp. The adobe walls stood like broken teeth against the sky, weathered by years of wind and rain. Sagebrush had grown through the ruins, nature slowly reclaiming what man had destroyed. Ayanna dismounted, her boots crunching on the gravelly earth. She wore simple traveling clothes, a brown leather vest over a white cotton shirt, dark pants, and worn boots. Her long black hair was braided with small turquoise beads, the only outward sign of her Apache heritage that she'd allowed herself to keep during her years of hiding in plain sight. The silence here was deafening. No birds sang. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She knelt beside what had once been her grandmother's dwelling, pulling the leather pouch from her saddlebag. "Grandmother," she whispered in Apache, then switched to English, a language that still felt foreign on her tongue when speaking to the spirits. "I've come to bring you home, to say goodbye properly." As she began to dig a small hole with her hands, the desert around her seemed to pulse with memories. She could almost see her younger self, running between the dwellings, laughing with her cousins, learning the old ways from her grandmother's patient hands. Then came that terrible day. The cavalry had arrived at dawn, claiming the Apache had raided a nearby settlement. Her father had tried to reason with them, speaking in broken English, showing them the peaceful nature of their small band. But hatred needs no translation. Ayanna closed her eyes, forcing the memories back into their dark corners. She'd survived by running, by hiding, by eventually making her way to Boston, where she'd learned to pass as Mexican or Spanish, anything but Apache. She'd built a life there, working as a seamstress, keeping her head down, speaking perfect English, pretending the desert had never called to her blood. But now, at 28, she'd finally found the courage to return. A gunshot echoed across the mesa, sharp and sudden. Ayanna's head snapped up, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol hidden beneath her vest. Another shot followed, then silence. She stood slowly, every instinct telling her to mount Takoda and ride away. This place had brought her nothing but pain. Why should she risk more? But something, perhaps her grandmother's spirit, perhaps simple human decency, made her climb onto a rocky outcrop to get a better view of the desert below. About a mile south, she could see dust clouds and the shapes of men on horseback. As she watched, 3 riders emerged from behind a cluster of red rocks, moving fast toward the main trail. Behind them, much slower, came a single horse carrying what looked like a wounded rider, slumped over the saddle. The pursuit was gaining ground. Ayanna found herself holding her breath as the lone rider's horse stumbled, nearly throwing its burden. The man, she could see now it was a man, managed to stay mounted but barely. Blood was visible on his shirt even from this distance. The 3 pursuers were closing in, their shouts carrying on the wind. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear enough. This wasn't a friendly chase. Her grandmother had always said that the desert tests a person's true nature. Run from those who need help, and the desert will remember. Show mercy, and it might show mercy in return. Ayanna looked down at the leather pouch still clutched in her hands, then at the drama unfolding below. Her quiet goodbye would have to wait. She whistled sharply for Takoda, who trotted over with the intelligence of a horse who'd learned to trust his rider's judgment. As she swung into the saddle, Ayana felt something shift inside her chest, a stirring she hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was time to stop running. She urged Takoda down the rocky slope toward whatever trouble awaited in the desert below. Behind her, the ruins of her childhood kept their silent vigil, and somewhere in the wind, she could swear she heard her grandmother's voice whispering approval. The three pursuers were close enough now that she could hear individual voices. "He's bleeding out anyway. Let the desert have him. Boss wants proof he's dead. Then we finish it now." Ayana's jaw tightened. She'd seen enough death in this place. Perhaps it was time to prevent some. As she rode toward the unfolding confrontation, the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The day of burial was becoming something else entirely, a day of choice, of action, of stepping back into a world she'd tried so hard to leave behind. But some ghosts, she was beginning to realize, could only be laid to rest by facing them head-on. The wounded man's horse collapsed just as Ayana reached the rocky outcropping that would give her the advantage of high ground. From here, she could see the full scope of the situation. 3 armed men closing in on their quarry, who had managed to take cover behind a fallen log near a dry creek bed. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stain spreading across his chest. "Damn it, Fletcher!" one of the pursuers called out. "Come out and die like a man instead of bleeding out like a dog." The wounded man, Fletcher apparently, raised his head just enough to shout back, his voice rough with pain and defiance. "Come and take me, Morrison, but you'll earn every step." Ayana studied the scene with tactical eyes her grandmother had trained, even as a child. The 3 pursuers had good position and numbers, but they were impatient, exposed on open ground. Fletcher had cover, but was clearly losing blood fast. His gun hand trembled as he tried to aim. She could ride away, should ride away. This wasn't her fight, and she'd spent 15 years learning that getting involved with white men's troubles only brought more trouble. But as she watched Fletcher struggle to reload his revolver with shaking hands, something in his determination reminded her of her father on that terrible day, outnumbered, outgunned, but refusing to surrender his dignity. Ayana checked her own pistol and the rifle in her saddle scabbard. She'd learned to shoot from her uncle, refined her skills during dangerous nights traveling alone through the territories. A woman, especially an Apache woman, learned to protect herself, or she didn't survive long. The decision made itself. She guided Takoda quietly through the rocks, circling wide to approach Morrison's group from behind. The afternoon sun was at her back, which would blind them if they turned to face her. Her grandmother's tactical wisdom: use every advantage the desert gives you, child. The earth, the sun, the wind, they all choose sides. "Fletcher!" Morrison called again. "Boss Kincaid's got $1,000 bounty on your head. Dead or alive, but dead's easier to transport." So this was about money, not justice. That made it simpler somehow. Ayana was close enough now to hear Fletcher's labored breathing. Blood had soaked through his shirt and vest, and his face was pale beneath several days' worth of stubble. But his eyes, steel gray and determined, held no surrender. "Tell Kincaid," Fletcher gasped, "that I've got something better than his money. I've got the truth about Copper Creek, and he knows it." "Dead men don't testify," Morrison laughed, signaling his companions to spread out. "Time to finish this." That's when Ayana made her presence known. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Her voice carried clearly across the desert silence. All 4 men froze, heads turning to locate the source. She sat on Takoda about 30 yards behind Morrison's group, rifle held casually but ready, the setting sun creating a silhouette that made her features hard to distinguish. "This ain't your concern, lady," Morrison called, though his voice held uncertainty. "Ride on." "This desert belongs to no one and everyone," Ayana replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "That man's under my protection now." Morrison squinted, trying to get a better look at her. "You got no authority here." "I've got Winchester authority," she said, raising the rifle slightly, "and I'm a better shot than all three of you combined." It wasn't an idle boast. Years of hunting to survive, of defending herself on lonely trails, had honed skills her Apache uncle had started and desperation had perfected. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you," one of Morrison's men pointed out. 3 targets, Ayana corrected. "I'll start with you, since you're so eager to do math." The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. In the silence, she could hear Fletcher's ragged breathing, could smell the metallic scent of blood on the wind. "Look, lady," Morrison tried a different approach. "This man's a wanted killer. We're just doing the law's work." "Whose law?" Ayana asked. "And wanted by who? A man named Kincaid, who's apparently afraid of the truth." Fletcher managed to lift his head, looking at her with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "You don't know me," he said hoarsely. "Why risk yourself?" Ayana kept her rifle trained on Morrison, but answered Fletcher, "Because I'm tired of good people dying while bad ones count their money." The standoff continued, sweat beading on faces despite the cooling air. Ayana could feel the familiar calm that came before action, the stillness her grandmother had taught her to find in moments of danger. Finally, Morrison made his choice. His hand moved toward his gun. Ayana's rifle cracked once, kicking up dirt between his feet. Before the echo faded, she'd worked the lever and aimed again. "Next one goes higher," she said calmly. Morrison's hand froze. His companions looked between him and the mysterious woman who'd appeared like some desert spirit. "This ain't over," Morrison growled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "No," Ayana agreed. "It isn't, but it's over for today." The 3 men mounted up, Morrison casting one last hate-filled look at both Fletcher and Ayana. "Kincaid's got a long reach," he warned, "and a longer memory." "Tell him I'm not hard to find," Fletcher called out, though the effort cost him. "I'll be waiting." After the 3 riders disappeared in a cloud of dust, Ayana quickly dismounted and hurried to Fletcher's side. Up close, the damage was worse than she'd thought. A bullet had caught him high in the chest, another had grazed his arm, and he'd lost a dangerous amount of blood. "That was either very brave or very stupid," Fletcher said as she knelt beside him, already reaching for the supplies in her saddlebags. "Maybe both," Ayana admitted, cutting away his shirt to examine the wounds. "But you're alive, so we'll call it brave." As she worked to stop the bleeding, Fletcher studied her face. "Apache," he said, not a question but a recognition. Ayana's hands paused for just a moment. "Does that change anything?" Fletcher's grey eyes met hers, and she saw no fear there, no disgust, only curiosity and growing respect. "Changes everything," he said quietly. "Makes it braver." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended the differences in their blood, their histories, their worlds. Here in the desert, where her people had lived and died, where his people had hunted and been hunted, they were just 2 souls refusing to let darkness win. "What's your name?" Fletcher asked as she bandaged his wounds with strips torn from her spare shirt. "Ayana. It's beautiful." "What does it mean?" "Eternal blossom," she said, then added with dry irony, "though I haven't felt much like blooming lately." Fletcher managed a weak smile. "Maybe it's time to start." As the sun set behind them, painting the desert in brilliant oranges and purples, Ayana helped Fletcher onto Takoda. Her grandmother's ashes would have to wait another day. Right now, she had a wounded gunslinger to keep alive, and something told her that this unexpected burden might be exactly what she'd come to the desert to find. Behind them, the ruins of her childhood kept their patient vigil, and ahead lay uncertainty. But for the first time in 15 years, Ayana felt like she was moving toward something instead of running away. The cave was hidden behind a curtain of desert willow, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Ayana had discovered it as a child, playing in the maze of red rock canyons that honeycombed the mesa. Now, 15 years later, it provided exactly what she needed: shelter, privacy, and most importantly, water. A small spring bubbled up from deep in the earth, creating a pool no bigger than a wash basin before disappearing again into the rock. The Apache believed such springs were sacred, places where the Earth Mother shared her life force with those who truly needed it. Fletcher needed it now. She'd managed to get him here as the last light faded, half carrying him when he could no longer stay upright in the saddle. His fever had started during the ride, and by the time she'd settled him on the blankets she'd spread near the spring, he was barely conscious. "Drink," she urged, holding a tin cup to his lips. The water was cool and clean, tasting faintly of minerals and something indefinable that spoke of deep earth and older times. Fletcher's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her with difficulty. "Where?" "Safe," Ayana said simply. "A place my people knew. Hidden." He tried to sit up and immediately fell back, pain creasing his features. The bullet wounds had reopened during the ride despite her field dressing, and fresh blood stained the bandages. "I need to clean these properly," she told him, already heating water over a small fire she'd built near the cave entrance. The smoke would dissipate in the rocks above, invisible to anyone tracking them. Fletcher watched her move with efficient purpose, her Apache training evident in every action. Nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "Not yet," Ayana replied, testing the water temperature. "Ask me again in a few days." As she cleaned his wounds by firelight, Fletcher told her his story in fragments between waves of pain. He'd been a sheriff in Copper Creek, a small mining town 2 days' ride north. Honest work, decent pay, a chance to build something good in a hard land. Then Samuel Kincaid had arrived with his money and his private army, claiming legal right to mineral surveys that would shut down half the town. When Fletcher had started asking questions about Kincaid's paperwork, about the sudden deaths of several prospectors who'd refused to sell their claims, about the Mexican families who'd simply vanished one night, that's when the bounty had been placed on his head. "I've got evidence," Fletcher said, as Ayana stitched the worst of his wounds with thread from her sewing kit. "Papers that prove Kincaid's been murdering people to steal their land. But I need to get them to the territorial authorities in Phoenix." "Why didn't you go straight there?" Ayana asked, trying to keep him talking to distract from the pain. "Tried. Kincaid's got men watching the main roads. I was taking the back trails when they caught up to me." Fletcher's jaw clenched as she pulled the thread tight. "If they'd killed me today, the truth dies with me." Ayana finished the stitching and sat back, studying his face in the firelight. He had strong features, weathered by sun and wind, marked by the kind of lines that came from squinting into trouble rather than hiding from it. His hands, she'd noticed, were calloused from honest work, but gentle when he didn't think she was watching. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why what? Why fight for people you barely know? You could have taken Kincaid's money, looked the other way. Most men would have." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the cave ceiling where shadows danced in the firelight. "My father was a sheriff too," he finally said. "In Kansas. When I was 12, a wealthy rancher tried to drive out a family of German farmers who'd settled on land he wanted. My father could have been bought, probably should have been from a practical standpoint. We were poor, and the rancher was offering real money. But he didn't take it. No, He stood with the farmers. And when the rancher sent his men to burn them out, my father was there to stop it. Fletcher's voice grew quiet. It cost him his life, but those farmers lived, raised their children, built something good on that land. Ayanna felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of kindred spirit. You're trying to live up to his memory. I'm trying to live with myself, Fletcher corrected. Your people understand that, I think. The idea that some things are worth dying for. My people are dead, Ayanna said flatly, then immediately regretted the bitterness in her voice. Fletcher turned his head to look at her, seeing past the careful walls she'd built. But you're alive, and you're here. That means something. She wanted to argue, to tell him that her survival meant nothing, that she was just going through the motions until she could find the courage to join her family in whatever came after. But sitting here in this sacred place, tending his wounds, sharing water and fire and honest words, it felt like something more than mere survival. Tell me about them, Fletcher said softly. Your family. The words stuck in her throat at first. She'd never spoken of them to anyone, had buried their memory as deeply as she'd buried her Apache identity. But here, in this cave that had sheltered her people for generations, with this wounded stranger who'd risked everything for justice, the silence finally cracked. She told him about her grandmother, who'd known every plant in the desert and its use, who'd taught her that strength came not from hiding pain, but from transforming it into wisdom. About her father, who'd tried to bridge two worlds until both had rejected him. About her mother, who'd sung ancient songs while weaving baskets that held the stories of their people. About the day the cavalry had come, and how she'd hidden in these very rocks while smoke rose from her childhood, and the desert learned new colors of grief. Fletcher listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, tears were cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks, but her voice was steady. They live in you, he said simply. In your skills, your courage, your choice to help someone who needed it. That's not nothing, Ayanna. That's everything. Outside, the night wind sang through the rocks with voices that might have been memory or might have been hope. The spring bubbled its ancient song, and the fire painted their faces in warm light that softened the edges of old pain. For the first time in 15 years, Ayanna felt something other than alone. Your fever's breaking, she said, touching his forehead. You should sleep. What about you? I'll keep watch. Morrison and his men might come looking. Fletcher's hand found hers, his fingers warm and calloused and surprisingly gentle. Thank you, he said, for the cave, the water, the care, for seeing me as more than just another wounded stranger. Thank you, she replied, for seeing me as more than just another Apache. As Fletcher drifted toward healing sleep, Ayanna sat by the dying fire and felt something long frozen beginning to thaw in her chest. She'd come to this place to bury the past, but instead she was discovering that some things, hope, connection, the possibility of belonging to something larger than grief, refused to stay buried. The desert wind whispered through the cave entrance, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, in this hidden sanctuary where sacred water flowed and two wounded souls had found unexpected shelter in each other, healing was possible. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in patterns her grandmother had taught her to read, and for the first time in years, they seemed to be spelling out a future worth fighting for. 3 days later, Fletcher was strong enough to sit up without dizziness, and Ayanna knew their time in the cave was ending. His wounds were healing cleanly, his fever had broken completely, and the color had returned to his face. More importantly, Morrison's men had found their trail. She'd spotted the dust cloud from the cave entrance just after dawn, 3 riders working their way systematically through the canyon, checking every possible hiding place. They had maybe 2 hours before the searchers reached this section of the maze. "We need to move," she told Fletcher, already packing their supplies. He nodded, testing his strength as he stood. The bullet wound in his chest still pained him, but he could ride. "There's something I need to tell you first." Ayanna paused in her packing, hearing a new tone in his voice. Fletcher reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather document case, worn and stained, but intact. "This is what Kincaid wants destroyed, what Morrison's men are really after." He opened the case, revealing a stack of papers, deeds, surveys, correspondence, and sworn statements. Evidence that Kincaid's been using forged documents to steal mining claims. Names, dates, amounts, enough to hang him if it reaches the territorial authorities. Ayanna studied the documents, recognizing several place names. Some of these are Apache lands, sacred sites. "That's why I need your help," Fletcher said quietly. "Not just to get to Phoenix, but to make sure justice includes your people too. These papers prove Kincaid murdered Apache families to access silver deposits on their traditional grounds." The weight of what he was asking settled on her shoulders. It meant abandoning her plans to disappear back into anonymity. It meant stepping fully into a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. It meant trusting that this time, this man would be different. But as she looked at Fletcher's earnest grey eyes, at the evidence of crimes that had torn apart families like her own, Ayanna felt her grandmother's spirit stirring in her chest. "Some fights chose you, whether you wanted them or not." "All right," she said, "but we do this my way, Apache way." Fletcher smiled, the first full smile she'd seen from him. "I was hoping you'd say that." They left the cave as the sun reached its peak, taking a route Ayanna had learned as a child, narrow trails that wound through red rock formations, invisible from below, known only to her people. Fletcher followed without question, trusting her knowledge of the land absolutely. By evening, they'd covered more ground than Morrison's group could have imagined possible. They made camp in another hidden spot, a grove of cottonwoods around a seasonal creek that would muffle the sound of their horses and fire. As they shared a meal of rabbit she'd snared and wild onions she'd gathered, Fletcher asked, "What will you do? After Phoenix, I mean." Ayanna had been wondering the same thing. For 15 years, her only plan had been survival, then a final goodbye to the past. Now, suddenly, the future stretched ahead like uncharted territory, full of possibility and terror in equal measure. "I don't know," she admitted. "I can't go back to Boston. That life was borrowed, not real. You could stay in Arizona territory. There's good land opening up for settlement, honest settlement, not Kincaid's kind of theft." She looked at him across the firelight, seeing not just the wounded stranger she'd saved, but the man he was becoming to her, someone whose dreams might have room for her own. "What about you? After you testify, after Kincaid's dealt with?" "I was thinking maybe I'd like to try ranching instead of sheriffing, somewhere quiet, where a man could build something lasting." Fletcher's eyes met hers. "Somewhere a woman could practice traditional crafts, maybe teach children about the old ways alongside the new ones, if she wanted to." The offer hung between them, delicate as a spider's web, strong as the bonds they'd forged in 3 days of shared danger and growing trust. Ayanna felt her heart beating against her ribs like a caged bird suddenly seeing open sky. "That sounds," she began, then stopped as Dakota nickered softly, ears pricked toward the darkness beyond their camp. Fletcher's hand moved to his gun as Ayanna silently drew her knife. They'd grown attuned to each other's movements, communicating without words. A voice called from the darkness, "Hello, the camp. I'm coming in, peaceful." An old Apache man emerged from the shadows, his weathered hands visible and empty. Ayanna's breath caught. She recognized him, though age had carved new lines in his face. "Uncle," she whispered in Apache. Joseph Crowfeather smiled, his eyes crinkling with joy and relief. "Little Blossom, we heard you had returned to the sacred places." They embraced while Fletcher watched respectfully, understanding that something profound was happening, even though he couldn't follow the rapid Apache conversation. Her uncle had news. Word of Kincaid's crimes had reached other Apache bands, other tribes. People were ready to stand with any white law officer brave enough to speak for justice. If Fletcher would accept Apache witnesses, Apache evidence, there were survivors ready to testify about families murdered, children stolen, sacred sites desecrated. "He's asking if you'll let our people help," Ayana translated for Fletcher. Fletcher stood, extending his hand to Joseph Crowfeather in the white man's gesture of respect. "I'd be honored," he said simply. That night marked a turning point for Ayana as news of surviving family and renewed Apache resilience began to break through her long-held isolation. She realized she had never truly been alone. 2 weeks later, Samuel Kincaid faced justice, with Ayana bravely testifying about the massacre for the first time. Fletcher stood by her side, proving that trust and loyalty could exist across cultural lines. 6 months on, Ayana and Fletcher built a home together on land that honored both Apache tradition and a shared future. Their wedding blended cultures, symbolizing a union rooted in healing and mutual respect. As Ayana scattered her grandmother's ashes in their garden, she gave thanks for survival, courage, and the love that had grown from pain. She had come seeking closure and instead found renewal, a future shaped not by forgetting the past, but by growing from it. In saving Fletcher, Ayana had saved herself. The girl who once hid in shadows had become a woman standing in the light, and the desert bore silent witness to her transformation.